Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're gonna give a few moments for people to get connected to audio. We'll start in a couple minutes. In the meantime, if you are willing and would like to share your name, if it's not already in your display name, that will be helpful for us to have an accurate record of who's all in attendance. So if you're able to put that in the chat, that would be great. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else in the waiting room, and it looks like most people are connected. So we can go ahead and get started. So this is a neighborhood meeting for a rezoning request. It has a case number of Z-18-22. It's by the Transit Overlay District to the Western Corridor of Bus Rapid Transit. My name is Hannah Reckow. I'm a planner with Raleigh Planning and Development. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, also in Planning and Development, John Anagnost and JP Mansell. And we are going to give a presentation kind of to start us off, go over the TOD mapping project, where we're considering mapping the TOD, what the process looks like, where the opportunities for engagement are, and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So as we're going through this, please feel free to use the chat if you think of questions you'd like us to address, and we'll take a look at those starting afterwards. So I'll start, take a step back and talk about bus rapid transit. This is a new type of transit service you may be aware of, has come into Wake County and Raleigh. There's a couple of features sort of detailed on the slide that differentiate it from normal bus service. There's a dedicated lane. It's not competing with car traffic. Fares are collected on stations rather than stops, and there's sort of level boarding that make it kind of work faster, more reliably. And so there's four routes that are coming to Raleigh, each from downtown, one west on Western Boulevard towards Cary, one going south on South Wilmington Street towards Garner, one going east on New Bern Avenue, and then another one on north going on Capitol Boulevard. And so we have this new transit service, major transit infrastructure that's coming to Raleigh. And the city also started to think about how we want to grow around that transit service. So you may have been familiar with a project called Equitable Development Around Transit. This was a project that asked, given we have this new infrastructure coming to the city and the city is growing and going to continue to grow, do we want to continue to grow around cars and driving, or accommodate some of that growth in a different way around this new transit service in a way that allows people to get where they need to go using transit and walking and biking. So this was a public process And what we kind of overwhelmingly heard was an interest in taking a new direction and growing around the transit service. So a handful of tools came out of that project. One major one is Raleigh's zoning code. So Raleigh has an official zoning map. Every property in the city is in one of a number of zoning districts that regulate development. So that includes uses that can locate the types of uses, and then also the development itself, how high the building is, things like where on the site it is, and then things like parking and stormwater infrastructure. And so every property has a zoning district on the official zoning map. Some properties also have what's called an overlay district, which is a second layer of zoning that works together with the first to regulate development. And so the city has a new overlay called the TOD, or Transit Overlay District. And this is a district that's intended to apply to areas around this BRT, bus rapid transit service. And so there are a couple goals of the TOD in terms of how it regulates new development. Goal is to discourage more dispersed suburban and car-oriented development in these areas, and encourage new uses, including jobs, housing, services, to locate in those areas so that there's more destinations that are accessible by transit. And then another element of that is a mix of uses, but also the urban form, the streetscape is easy to use as someone who's walking or biking, and there's good public spaces there as well. So those are the general goals. I have a few images here of what that can look like in concept. So many of us may have been to somewhere where sort of the image on the top left, it's very suburban, a lot of one-story buildings, drive up, park in a parking lot right next to the building and go to your use, and then maybe leave and go somewhere else the same way. So the TOD is thinking that's not the ideal built form near future bus rapid transit, and a better form is the image on the bottom, where we have maybe higher density right near the station, and then that tapers off as you get a little farther away from that. So greater number of jobs, homes can locate right near a station. And then on a similar note, that having a mix of uses within the same building or within the same block helps that ground floor have be an active space where people are really living their lives. They're going to cafes, going shopping, going to work. It's really a place that is lived in. And then a few other some similar concepts. How easy is it to get from the sidewalk, if there is one, to the front of a building? I think many of us have probably been to a one-story suburban shopping center where you have to drive in. But how can development bring those doors closer to the sidewalk, make it a safe and comfortable place for people to walk to destinations that may be a little farther away from the street? And then finally, public space is a big part of this. Is there a public plaza for people to meet up, spend time in, and is it a pleasant place to be? Is there the infrastructure to get there? And are there the amenities there that make it worth staying? So that's sort of in concept, the goals of the overlay and sort of the type of development it is discouraging and encouraging. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it does that, how it regulates new development. It touches on a number of elements in Raleigh's zoning code. I'm going to talk about a few, and then when we get to the question and answers, if you have questions about things we did not cover, please feel free to ask, but these are kind of some of the highlights of what the overlay does. So one is prohibited uses. There are a list of uses that, if they're normally permitted in the underlying zoning, would be prohibited in the TOD. These include car-oriented uses, so things like car dealerships, car wash, car repair shops are not well suited to be near transit. We want that space to be used for uses that people are going to get to using transit by walking and by biking. And so this would say new development of those uses should locate elsewhere. And this another category is sort of lower intensity residential development. So things like single family and duplex housing are one of the prohibited uses. And I'll talk a little bit more about that asterisk and how this really is applying to new development in a moment. So the second way that the overlay regulates development is it's called dimensional standards. That means how high the building is, setbacks, where it is on the property. And so in encouraging more density closer to transit, one of the things that the overlay does is it has a minimum building height of 2 stories. So that would mean if someone came in and wanted to build some new use in the overlay, it would have to be at least 2 stories. A second way is how it applies to properties in residential zoning districts. Most of the area that the TOD is being mapped to is mixed use, but there are some areas with residential districts, and in those areas, it would the overlay would allow development to follow the standards of the setbacks of the residential mixed use or RX district. So that allows some smaller setbacks in areas in a TOD. And then finally, there are requirements currently in Raleigh's code for what's called the neighborhood transition yard, and that's something that applies between residential and mixed use zoning districts where they are right next to each other. And the TOD would allow a shorter neighborhood transition yard in those circumstances in a TOD. The feature of the TOD is notable is a height bonus. So there's 2 situations where the transit overlay district offers you to build higher than the underlying zoning would allow in exchange for either locating affordable housing or locating jobs on the property. So the housing one would allow 50% increase in how tall the building could be, how many stories it could be, if 20% of the additional units you can build with that height are affordable, and that's affordable for incomes less than 60% of area median income, and if they stay affordable for at least 30 years. And then the second height bonus applies to development that would locate new jobs in the TOD, and so you'd get a 30% height bonus for a fully non-residential development. And then talk through what happens when there's an existing use, an existing structure that has the TOD on it, and it does not align with the TOD rules. So that's something called being non-conforming. There's a new structure, or rather, there's an existing structure that already exists, has the TOD applied over it, and it doesn't meet the TOD standards. Let's say, for example, it's only one story tall. That structure can be rebuilt, renovated, like for like, if in the case that it needs repairs or it gets damaged in some way. In a similar way, if there's an existing use that's established in a TOD, for example, a car wash that's prohibited, that use can continue to operate. And in the case that it were to be no longer operating for a period of time, as long as it's less than 2 years, that use can be reestablished on that site as well. So existing structures and uses that already in the TOD, if they're not conforming, they can continue to operate, they can be maintained. And then there's also some provisions in this code to expand those uses of those structures. It would involve going to the Board of Adjustment and asking for a special use permit. Those are some of the main features of the TOD. Like I said, we can talk in more detail if anyone has questions. I'm going to turn now towards the rezoning request. So the city has this new overlay district in its zoning code, but it doesn't regulate development unless it's added to the zoning map. And so the process of that, changing the zoning map is a rezoning request. This is a change that only city council can approve. And it's a public process, has a series of public meetings. I will go over the process in a moment. The area to be rezoned that we're talking about on Z-18-22 is some properties along Western Boulevard from downtown to I-40. We have an interactive map online that you can view and zoom in and search for properties. And we can put that link directly in the chat tonight. It's also available on our project page. Before we turn to questions, I wanted to talk through kind of how we came to this request. As you can see, it's the district boundary is a little bit irregular along the corridor, and so there was some thinking behind that. Really, the goal of applying the overlay now is to encourage future growth along this BRT corridor, encourage it to be more transit oriented. And so wanted to apply it to areas that are, first of all, within walking distance of the future BRT route. And for those purposes, that was defined as about a quarter mile, is generally walkable for people. And then wanted to apply it to areas that are either already able to redevelop with more compact development or likely to redevelop in the future. So staff came up with a number of criteria that if a property fell into was put in the request and applied these criteria just along the whole corridor uniformly. And so these are the criteria. If a property had mixed use zoning or heavy industrial zoning, so already can develop with non-residential mixed use development, properties that are planned for mixed use, medium or high scale residential on the future land use map. That's a policy map in the comprehensive plan that recommends future land use. And this criteria really was looking at larger properties that might redevelop. So if it was less than an acre in size, it was not included. And then areas, regardless of zoning or regardless of what the future land use map recommends, that are right along the BRT route. So they're right on Western Boulevard, they're right on the future alignment of Western. And again, we're looking at not interested in this request of much smaller properties that are half an acre in size or less. And then finally, properties that are currently an apartment building or somehow common ownership with an apartment building and might, and then city-owned property as well, not including parks and greenways were included. So we looked at the quarter mile area around the future Western corridor, and the properties you see on that map in purple are those that fell in one of these categories, with the exception of a few things. And this is sort of the disclaimer here. There were a number of situations where it was obvious it was not suitable for TOD. And that included things like cemeteries, schools, state property, rail property, or areas that are cut off by a rail line. It's not feasible to be walkable. Historic properties with historic designation, either landmark or a local and national district or a neighborhood conservation overlay district. And then there's a couple of city zoning districts, conservation management, plan development, and then the downtown mixed use, which this request is not applying TOD to those areas either. So we'll turn now to process. Like I said, this is a public process, the rezoning process. This is a flow chart, sort of summarizes the process overall. As I mentioned, it does end in front of City Council at a meeting where they make the final decision. We are currently at sort of the beginning middle stages of the process at the second neighborhood meeting. Staff has submitted a formal zoning application for this request, and it is being reviewed right now. The next step will be to schedule it for a planning commission meeting. So the planning commission is an appointed body appointed by City Council, and they review rezoning requests. So that'll be a public meeting to discuss this rezoning request. There will be an opportunity for the public to speak at that meeting. And then the planning commission will deliberate, and they will work towards making a formal recommendation to either approve or deny the zoning request to City Council. And then City Council will then hold a public hearing, similarly a public meeting. It's a venue for public discussion, and they will ultimately make a vote. So in this image, the blue stars are the opportunities for public engagement. Also listed them here. Number of ways that you can get involved. I mean, you already are involved because you're at this first bullet at a neighborhood meeting. The city has a rezoning engagement portal, which is an online survey essentially, where you can ask questions and leave comments. This is a great way to participate. All the comments that we are going to get, questions and comments we will get from this survey will be packaged up and delivered to the Planning Commission. So they will have a body of comments, written comments in one place. But you can also participate by showing up to Planning Commission, either listening, watching the meeting. Although we're now shifting towards the council and commission meetings are now in person. So that's a place where you can show up and speak on the matter if you'd like. And then same for City Council, another public venue for participation. Talk a little bit more about the portal and how you can get to it. One way is to get to this project's webpage, which is at raleighnc.gov, and then use the search feature to search for TOD mapping. There's a link directly to the Western survey, or if you're familiar with the rezoning engagement portal, you've already been there, you can search for the one called TOD mapping Western BRT. And I'll make a note here that if you are interested, we have gotten a few requests of this nature to be removed or to be added to the request, that you do so through the portal, and in your comment, include your name, the address you're referring to, and your request, just so we have all that information together and can and move forward with that information. And finally, a few other ways to stay in touch. If you received a mailed invitation to this meeting or saw a sign, we will continue to be advertising these future meetings with mailed notices and posted signs. Also have on the project page, there's a place where you can sign up for email updates. So you would know about future meetings that way. And then you should always feel free to reach out to staff. Please feel free to give us a call or send us an email if you have questions or want to discuss something. Really encourage that. So I think this is the end of my presentation. See, we've got a bunch of comments in the chat. Didn't know if maybe we wanted to, before we jump into those comments, just see if anyone has a question that relates to whether or not their property is in or out of the request. If you have a question like that, if you could write in the chat or raise your hand, and we can answer those questions all together.
Hi, this is Dayon. I've put my question in the chat. I'm the owner of 4000 Greenleaf. I've put my request in last meeting in the portal, but haven't got any feedback yet.
Yes, I think I saw your request in the engagement portal. Yeah, we will. We're still in the process of collecting those requests. I expect Planning Commission to consider them when they take up the case. But yeah, if you have a request like that, the engagement portal is the best place to put it.
I have a question, please. I live in a neighborhood, Raleigh Acres, and we have a neighborhood conservation overlay. This corridor and the, I don't know what you call it, the outer edges of the corridor, the gray area on the map, do not include our neighborhood, but are close. How are we protected from any rezoning of our neighborhood?
So if the question is, if someone wanted to rezone your neighborhood, they would need to formally request to the city that change to the zoning map, and that would require, I believe that would require in certain circumstances that would require the property owners to sign on to it, and it would definitely require direct notification of that request.
What I'm trying to ask is, how does this TOD, which comes close to our neighborhood, affect us? Because there have been rumors that the TOD is going to encourage high density housing, et cetera, and that neighborhoods such as mine will be susceptible to this because we are in the TOD area. We're not in it, we're not in the purple, we're not in the gray, but we're close.
Can I jump in on that one?
Yes, please.
So, I think there's kind of two different things that we're talking about here. So there's TOD overlay zoning that the city is applying, and that is focused on the properties that are within a quarter mile or have some portion of a property within a quarter mile of the BRT, the bus rapid transit routes. There is another topic, which is that Raleigh is growing rapidly right now, and there's a lot of interest in developing housing in all parts of Raleigh. So, the people who want to buy property in Raleigh and build more housing, we can't force them to go away. I mean, that's the nature of the society that we live in. It's a free market society. If those people want to make an offer on other people's property and the other people accept those offers, that is legal, and the city cannot, in most, 99% of cases, can't and isn't going to block that. So what we're going to do with the transit overlay district is the areas that are closest to this bus rapid transit public investment, expenditure of public dollars, is to try to ensure that if there is going to be redevelopment, that is the type of redevelopment that is going to make the bus rapid transit successful and functional and effective for existing and new residents. So, the way that your neighborhood would be protected would be that individual property owners either don't request to rezone their own property, or don't sell their property to someone who would. But the city has policies that speak to existing residential areas. So if someone did request to rezone your neighborhood, which I understand there is a zoning case in your neighborhood now for a fairly large vacant parcel, those policies come into play, policies from the city's 2030 comprehensive plan that say, character of new development should be similar to existing development nearby. And so, that zoning case, like Hannah said, is going to be treated on its individual merits. It's separate from the city initiated TOD rezoning. It is its own zoning case, and that's a good example of what Hannah was talking about. Someone purchased or got a property under contract, and they have initiated their own private rezoning. So, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you.
Good evening, guys. My name is Timothy, and I'm the priest of the Orthodox Church that comes in the rezoning list of properties. Thank you for bringing this together to inform the public about it. But one thing that I really was a bit concerned about was we were never informed about this rezoning, and we only came to know that our property was in the rezoning list because one of our parishioners happened to get a notice in his office, and then because he's the secretary of the parish, he just happened to see that the property was listed in the rezoning. So do you make sure that you actually inform everyone given in the address that your particular, or the individuals or the churches or the organizations property is going to be in the rezoning? Or, like, for example, I came to know about it because my parishioner informed me. Otherwise, I would have not known about it at all. So so I'm just a bit curious about the process and how the public is informed. And especially, because, we're a church, we're an organization that comes in and our property is listed in there. So I was just a bit concerned. Is there a way? Of course, I think Hannah explained that we can go into the portal, maybe ask more questions and be more informed, and maybe give our email, be in the communication. But what was the initial process of letting the public know that, hey, your property is going to be in the rezoning list for the TOD?
I hate to answer a question with a question, but do you receive mail that's addressed to 225 Bashford Road?
Call from unknown.
Sorry, do I get mail?
Do you receive mail that is addressed to 225 Bashford Road? That's the mailing address that's listed for the church property in the Wake County Revenue Department files. That's where.
Yeah,
right?
we have a mailbox. So we have a mailbox. We have our trustee who checks these mails on a regular basis. So we don't seem to have gotten this particular mail. So that's, otherwise I would not have asked a redundant question. So.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that that is the accurate address. Sometimes people's mailing address that's listed in the county records is not where they actually receive mail. So I just want to make sure, because that is the primary way that we would have notified you, is that we have sent out postcards for the first set of meetings we had, and then a letter for the previous meeting, and then a letter for this meeting, and they would have all been addressed to 225 Bashford Road. So I'm not sure why those didn't make it to your mailbox, but that is how we use the Wake County tax addresses. And I think I have to assume that many of the folks here have received those letters, and that's what brought them here. The other thing I'll note is that we did place signs along the road, and we did place signs on Bashford Road for all three of those meetings, the previous two and this one. That is part of the required notice for these meetings. So I'll make a note to check our mailing list and see if that address is on there, but I don't know why you didn't receive those letters.
I can double check because there's a couple of one is listed as 225, one is listed at 229. So I need to confirm that as well. So, but it's good to know that maybe the address that's given in the city might be different from where we might receive the mail. So I'll confirm that with the church secretaries and trustees, and so that we are all on the same page. But thank you.
I see a couple hands up. You can address these questions and then turn to the questions in the chat. So I think, let's see. I'm going to ask to unmute. You can ask your question.
Hey, this is Peyote Perriman. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Hey, thank you. I was curious, in the TOD, what measures can you put in place in that zoning that encourage walkability? So you're allowing for more density. Is there any requirements for sidewalks to be built alongside these bigger buildings or more dense developments? And then also, I guess in the same thing is, would there also be additional stormwater measures to be set along the TOD corridor? Or in particular, the housing that's within a quarter mile, will that be subject to additional stormwater measures that goes along with increased density?
So the question about walkability, the main way that the TOD achieves that goal is by requiring development. If it doesn't have what's called an urban frontage, that it must conform to what is called the urban limited frontage. And so frontages are basically additional layers of zoning that go on top of whatever the base zoning is on a piece of property, kind of like this transit overlay district, it's a similar mechanism. And so frontages basically say where the building has to be in relation to the street. So how close, it's almost like the opposite of a setback. So a setback says a building has to be at least 20 feet away from the street. The frontage says the building has to be within 20 feet of the street, cannot be set back more than 20 feet from the street. And the purpose of that, and in the urban frontages also say you cannot have parking between the street and the building. And so the purpose is that when a person is walking, they have a really easy way to get to the entrance of the building. They're not having to cross a large parking lot and walk between vehicle lanes or parking spaces, that it is the building is oriented towards people and not cars. The other thing about the urban frontages is that they require specific sidewalks. So the minimum sidewalk in Raleigh is a 6-foot sidewalk. And that's what you see in a lot of more suburban contexts like shopping centers. And what the urban frontages say is that they're called streetscapes, is basically the requirements for where you have the street trees, the sidewalk, the curb and gutter, all those components together form the streetscape. And so there are only certain streetscapes that you're allowed to have in urban frontages. And the ones that you are limited to have wider sidewalks. So 8-foot or 10-foot wide sidewalks. And in addition to that, with the typical, the minimum 6-foot sidewalk, the tree planting areas are within a grass strip that runs the length of the sidewalk. So it's basically, 3 feet of grass with a tree every 40 feet and then a 6-foot sidewalk. In the streetscapes that are required in the urban frontages, the trees go in a tree grate. There's a tree box under the sidewalk. And so in between those trees, every 40 feet, there's more sidewalk. There's not a grass strip. And so that's additional space for pedestrians and bicycles. And you can also have benches there. That also allows more space. If, say, a restaurant wanted to have outdoor seating on their private property, that gives kind of an additional, area of activity in front of the restaurant. So that's kind of how the other thing about improving pedestrian connections is that the zoning code says that you can, through a rezoning case, request to be exempted from new street connections when you develop a site. And what the TOD says is you are not able to do that as easily. You have to make a stronger case for why you need to be not, allowed to not make a new street connection. And all public streets in Raleigh are required to have sidewalks on both sides. Now, that being said, there may still be instances where someone could pay a fee in lieu instead of building the sidewalk in front of a new development. I am not going to guarantee that 100% of new development in the TOD overlay is going to build a sidewalk. And that's going to be particularly true for single family houses. In a lot of cases, single family houses don't have to build the sidewalk, they pay a fee in lieu. The stormwater question, the TOD does not apply additional stormwater requirements compared to whatever the base zoning is. So the city has a stormwater requirement that basically says the volume of runoff, of stormwater runoff that leaves the site must be the same after the development as it was before the development for the 2-year rain event and the 10-year rain event. So that means that a rain event that occurs every 2 years, it's large enough that it only occurs every 2 years, or large enough that it only occurs every 10 years. So that standard still applies, and also water quality standards apply as well. So nitrogen reduction for stormwater treatment. So those are the same standards. And the city also has a number of ways that it encourages green stormwater infrastructure. Green stormwater infrastructure is basically like additional landscaping that has stormwater benefits on a site, and also tends to have aesthetic benefits as well. So that's encouraged in the city zoning code. Is not currently, there aren't any currently any specific requirements for green stormwater infrastructure. The city council has directed staff to start working on ways that could be made mandatory. And there's a process going on right now from the stormwater division to look at ways that we could mandate green stormwater infrastructure.
Thanks, John. I've got 2 follow-ups for that. In terms of having a payment in lieu on single family homes, is there any way that that language could be tightened up so that it would be more encouraging for developers to put in sidewalks? And I mention this specifically because there was a cottage court development in my neighborhood where they added 10 homes onto a parcel of approximately 2 acres. They used to have 1 home. Across the street from this cottage court development is a bus stop, a city bus stop, and there's no sidewalk. And that developer paid in lieu to not put sidewalks in on Driftwood. But part of the rezoning to allow that was because of the TOD, because of the proximity to transportation up on Western, because it was within a quarter mile. And I just don't know if that's something that could be written into this TOD to encourage people to actually put the sidewalks in, to let people get to Western Boulevard where the bus stations are going to be. And then second, my understanding is that the city's also re-examining those stormwater standards so that the 10-year and the 2-year are not the minimum that development would meet. And especially when you have the amount of density going along this kind of corridor, that perhaps a 25 or 50-year stormwater control would be more appropriate. And has there been any discussions of adding that to this TOD?
So there have not been any discussions to add anything new to the current TOD ordinance. It is pretty set. Now, there could be changes in the future. That's up to the city council. And so you can certainly contact your council members and encourage them, if that's if that's what you'd like to do, to take up those issues. And I think they are pursuing, like you said, the additional stormwater controls. In terms of the single family being required to provide sidewalks, again, that would probably be a separate effort from the TOD, because that's a much bigger question. That would, and I guess you're saying only require that in the TOD. I would say it's unlikely that we're going to reopen the language of the overlay district for that topic. But again, you can contact city council members to encourage them to take up that issue in a more general sense. But the one thing I'll note about that, the cottage court scenario you described, that is kind of an odd scenario, and I understand your thought of, well, if there's additional density related to transit, should there not also be sidewalks included? I think that's a rational expectation. So I don't know all the details of that. in terms of single family, the thing I'll note is that the TOD does not allow brand new single family developments. So any single family development would really be, rebuilding or expansions of existing single family houses. So, that's less of an issue in the TOD because of that.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna unmute Elaine and ask a question.
Yes, we are at 106 Buck Jones. We have contemplated selling our house because of all this that's potentially going to be going on. I mean, they've already done the reconstruction of the road with the sidewalk and the out front. So we've got that right now. But since we do have an acre here, does this mean that the city may eventually take our property? Or that if we sell it, we could sell it to a developer and they have to look at this TOD knowing that they have to put something other than a single family house here?
So I think when you say take your property, you're thinking about the non-conformity question, that a single family house becomes non-conforming in the TOD. So when an existing structure or use becomes non-conforming, that does not mean you have to cease using that structure or use. The state law and the local law is very clear that as long as you continue to maintain and use that building or use, you can continue it in perpetuity, basically forever, so long as you continue to be in that use. So what the nonconformity is really saying is, if you left the house, if you vacated the house and no one lived there for a period of time, and then you tried to come back, then you might have to go to the Board of Adjustment and get a special use permit to reestablish that use, or you might be prohibited from reestablishing that use. And so, yeah, the city does not want to tell you need to leave your single family house. All we're saying is, if you chose to do something with your property in the future, the choice of tearing down your existing single family house and building a larger single family house is not going to be one of those options. You could tear down your single family house and build one that's the exact same size. That's allowed in the nonconformity rules. You just can't build a larger one. And that's really speaking to it's a pattern right now in Raleigh, in neighborhoods that are not zoned for multifamily development or zoned for low density multifamily development, that the market is basically pushing developers to tear down small houses and build very large houses. And what this TOD overlay is saying is, if you're going to tear down a single family house and build something new, you should be adding more housing units. You should be providing additional spaces for people to live if you're going to be doing redevelopment. And so for your particular property, this overlay could increase interest in your property because there would be more multifamily development options on your property.
John, the postcard size maps that you all keep sending us in the mail has at times shown the road, the new road, Western Boulevard extension, coming through our carport, coming across the corner of our yard where my storage sheds are, barely missing the storage sheds. The only postcard I haven't gotten is one that shows it running right damn square through the middle of my house. So can you say with any certainty that I'm not going to be forced out and have it torn down as my next door neighbor has?
I cannot speak to the project to extend Western Boulevard to Cary that is going to pass behind your property. That is a transportation project that is going to serve the bus rapid transit. That is the main reason that is being pursued, is to provide a pathway for bus rapid transit. And that is why the TOD is proposed along that alignment of Western Boulevard. But I can't tell you exactly where that street is going to go. Now, looking at the existing property behind your house, There is already some right-of-way dedicated there. That does look like there's a good chance that there's going to be some acquisition of a portion of your property, which would mean either the city or North Carolina Department of Transportation at some point would approach you and say, we'd like to compensate you for a portion of your property, as well as probably some construction easements. And there are cases where, yeah, if those construction easements get close enough to your house, like if they overlap with your house, it may be to the point where they would say, we'd like to purchase your entire property. But I cannot say whether that's going to happen or not.
Okay,
They've already bought, the city already bought 104 beside us and has torn down the house and cleared the lot and everything. So the last we know, that's kind of where the road is going. Is that accurate? It's gray on the map because the city already owns it.
So the alignment of Western Boulevard is directly behind your house and almost parallel to your rear lot line.
Okay.
But there is going to be, it looks like a new intersection between Buck Jones and Asbury Drive that is going to be coming close to your house. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I can't say that the way, so there's the information that we have now is the city's street plan, which shows that there should at some point in the future be an intersection of Buck Jones, Western Boulevard, and Asbury. That street plan is not the engineering specifications. It is conceptual. So the actual, the geometry and dimensions of that intersection don't get set by the street plan. They get set by an engineering project to design that extension of Western Boulevard. So again, until they actually start that engineering process, it is impossible to say where that intersection is going to land. I can tell you that with the cost of property and the cost of construction, I certainly think there will be a desire to minimize property acquisition. But again, it's too soon in the process to give you a firm answer on that question.
okay.
But we are safe to sell this either as a single family residence but we do have to disclose this information about the BRT. Is that correct? That it could potentially.
Yeah, I think you do have some obligation to disclose both the overlay zoning and the street construction planning. Yeah, I think those things are all relevant to a potential buyer.
But if it's rezoned, then a developer may be more interested in this acre of land.
Yeah, depending on how the street project plays out,
Okay.
And,
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, this is Larry Sneed. I pastor the little white church sitting on the corner, 100 Jones Franklin Road. I've got 100 Jones Franklin, 33 Zeebick, and 104 Jones Franklin. And I was curious as to how we're impacted, or can I have a separate meeting with somebody to talk about the intricacies there? Because we actually are planning on rebuilding on that property.
mm-hmm.
There's somebody I can talk to it separately.
Is this the Christ First Church?
Yeah, a little
Okay.
white church at 100 Jones Franklin.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think it would be good for us to have a conversation and go into some of that detail with the transit planning group here at the city, because that is getting a little bit into the bus rapid transit and the street construction process more so than the zoning process. But yes,
It's a little complex.
Over the road.
Who would I call? Who would I contact?
That's not them.
if
Decide.
you want to send if you want to email me or Hannah, and we can set up a meeting with the transit folks, and we'll get that going.
Okay. All right.
And
Thank
you mind sharing your name again for us?
Larry
Uh-huh.
Sneed, SNEAD. It's Christ First Christian Fellowship Center.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
I think it would be good if we turn to some of the questions in the chat, since I know folks have asked them a while ago. JP?
Yeah, I can kind of run through those in order. So D Shore asked, I assume confirming that gas stations will be prohibited in the TOD overlay.
Yeah, vehicle fuel sales are one of the car-oriented uses that are prohibited in the TOD. That's right.
Hunter Strickland asked if we have studied the potential for racially disparate impacts to prohibiting car dealerships, car washes, repair shops, et cetera, along the BRT corridor.
We have not.
And I'll just add to that the prohibited uses is really applying to new development. So existing businesses that might be a car dealership or a repair shop would be able to continue to operate and maintain those uses under the TOD.
Mark Senior asked, or that was looking to confirm that the TOD standards have been adopted, and so we're mostly discussing the actual mapping at this point.
Yes, the City Council adopted the TOD overlay as it is now last October, and then they turned around pretty quickly and asked staff to start the rezoning request to apply it. So this process is focused on amending the zoning map to have the TOD overlay along Western Boulevard.
Cole McMullen asked, instead of a density bonus program where private developers may be unwilling to take advantage of, why not bring a proposal to City Council to build public housing along the transit corridor, starting with public land and also using eminent domain to buy out car-oriented businesses?
Yeah, so the city is basically doing both of those things, although not to the extent of eminent domain. So the city Housing and Neighborhoods Department has funding mechanisms for production of affordable housing that is not part of a zoning requirement. It's there is a dedicated property tax that is for affordable housing. It generates about $5 million per year. And then there also was a bond referendum that was passed last year or the year before for, if I remember correctly, $80 million. And so a significant portion of those revenue streams, or revenue and bond funding, goes towards the production of new affordable housing. Some of it goes towards repair programs, down payment assistance programs, other mechanisms for assisting low-income folks to secure or remain in housing. A large portion of it goes to production of new affordable housing, and then to get more. And then the city is always working with private and nonprofit developers who are looking to develop affordable housing and need that additional financing, which is usually used to supplement federal low-income housing tax credits to make those projects pencil out where they don't quite cover their costs. And so in addition to just generally being both receptive to private and nonprofit developers who have already initiated their own projects, the city also seeks out land to acquire for affordable housing or uses city-owned land to produce affordable housing. And a great example is 2 projects are actually underway currently. 3 actually, 3 zoning cases are currently underway. One just east of Moore Square Park in downtown. The city is rezoning that property to allow additional height to produce affordable housing. And then there is the rezoning near Wilmington Street, Fayetteville Street near Eliza Pool Park, which has just been initiated as part of the Dick's Edge study for the city, that city-owned property, to again increase the allowed density to produce affordable housing. And then there's a third one at Bloodworth and I think it's Cabarrus. So that's kind of near the Lincoln Theater, a little bit east of there, which is also city-owned property, which is being rezoned, again, to increase the allowed density for affordable housing. Those are three examples. And so the city is pursuing those avenues. And then additionally, for each of the bus rapid transit routes, the city is pursuing area planning processes. So currently there's a station area planning process for New Bern Avenue that will be recommending property acquisition for production of affordable housing. And then there will be another planning process for Western Boulevard, followed by one for, well, it's not clear at this point which will come first, the Southern or the Western. But those two will also have area planning processes, which are likely to include recommendations for acquisition by the city to produce affordable housing. And I see a question in the chat that says, define affordable. And so, as Hannah mentioned during the presentation, the Transit Overlay District has a definition of affordable housing, which is households making less than 60% of the area median income. When it comes to affordable housing production through the dedicated property tax and the bond funding, those can be for a variety of income levels. And that has been a major conversation in the allocation of the bond funding, is what amount of that funding would go to housing that's affordable to different levels of income. And so, yes, I know that there's a desire that there be substantial funding that is targeted to households earning 30% or less of the area median income. And I know that that is one of the things that the Housing and Neighborhood Department is focusing on. But when it comes to federal low-income housing tax credits, there's a couple of different ways that those tax credits can be awarded based on different levels of income being served. And those range from about 30% to 80% typically of area median income.
Jen Truman asked, how do the areas selected for the overlay relate to the planned BRT station placements, and are existing sidewalk gaps being addressed through the Western Boulevard corridor study?
So that's a good question about the actual station locations. When we were drawing up this proposal for the rezoning, the exact locations of the stations had not been finalized. And to a certain extent, it still is not finalized. I think Western Boulevard engineering design for BRT is only just now getting to about the 30% design stage. And so, because of that uncertainty about where exactly the stations themselves would go, the way we chose the search area for parcels to include in the TOD rezoning was to draw a buffer of 1/4 mile from the corridor itself. So that's the public street that is hosting the BRT route. And we thought that was reasonable to use a 1/4 mile buffer because for the most part, BRT stations are placed about 1/2 mile apart because of the expectation that between 1/4 and 1/2 mile is the maximum distance that someone is willing to walk to get to transit service, or to walk comfortably, or wheelchair. And so the 1/4 mile buffer basically establishes an area where if there is a station every 1/2 mile, a buffer of 1/4 mile basically gets the entire intervening area between those two stations.
Ashley asked, what sort of factors would staff consider to remove a property from the proposed TOD map?
I think the two most likely criteria that we would look at is, number one, has there been a recent rezoning case, particularly conditional use rezoning that has included zoning conditions, but has there been a recent rezoning case for a type of development that is similar to what the TOD is seeking to achieve? So has someone gone to the city council, requested rezoning to build multifamily housing or mixed use development, and has had that public process where the city council has determined that type of development, with the knowledge that bus rapid transit is coming, has approved that development, or a development has approved the zoning that would enable that development. And in that case, if someone said, well, we've already gone through a process to establish what's allowed on our property, and the city council has said that that makes sense in this area near BRT, then I think we would say, if they want to request not having the TOD, and they're going to go ahead and build something that is already supportive of bus rapid transit, we could entertain that request. I think the other criterion that we would probably consider is the ownership. So is it a nonprofit or institutional owner, for instance, a church or a school, that, because we did exclude public schools and state property and city property. There could be private schools, or there could be churches who don't want to be included. And so I think we would consider those as well.
Jay Spain asked, have you examined the overall effects that the overlay would have on historic districts like Oakwood, Bordeaux, and Boylan Heights? What is to discourage a developer from purchasing a historic home in a local historic district and tearing it down after waiting the appropriate time to construct a condominium or apartment building that fits the TOD?
Mm-hmm. So the TOD is not proposed in any, this TOD rezoning is not proposing to apply the TOD in any local historic districts or National Register historic districts or on any local landmarks. And the reason for that was we just had not done enough detail of looking into what those impacts would be. And we are anticipating that we will be having those corridor planning processes that I described earlier. And, that's a good note that also with those corridor planning processes that come later, there is likely to be another round of this very same process, that we would go through this very same thing again to refine not only the transit overlay district, but also potentially the underlying zoning. So there might be some areas where the base zoning would be recommended to be changed by a city initiated rezoning case. And that is actually what's occurring right now with the New Bern Station area planning, is those recommendations will be released in the next month or so. And they will be proposing to apply the transit overlay district, and in some cases to change the underlying zoning. But again, that process was over a year of public engagement and detailed, looking at those particular neighborhoods and what the development pattern is. And we looked at these neighborhoods as well in this first TOD overlay. We spent a considerable amount of time, but we didn't do quite as much as public engagement as we would with the full corridor planning process. So, the TOD won't be applied by this process to those neighborhoods at this time.
Peyote Paramin asked what the timeline was for Western Boulevard expansion and if that has been voted on.
So the Western Boulevard extension was voted on in the sense that Raleigh and Cary and had to agree, and I think Wake County is also party to this, on what's called a locally preferred alternative, or an LPA. And a locally preferred alternative is basically any affected local governments that are pursuing a infrastructure investment like bus rapid transit have to come to terms with the kind of, before they actually dig into the engineering design and start investing money and paying consultants to do that engineering work, they have to agree where exactly the investment is going to go and what the scope of it is going to be. And that occurred, if I remember correctly, either early last year or late in 2020. Raleigh and Cary agreed, their respective councils, the city council and town councils of Raleigh and Cary agreed to the locally preferred alternative for the Western BRT corridor, which was for it to follow this Western Boulevard extension. And so that really is what set the ball rolling on this. And the other component of that is the reason you have to select not only just, how are you going to spend local dollars, make sure you're spending local dollars on something that you know is going to move forward, is that the locally preferred alternative is also the first step to securing federal grant funding, or one of the steps that they had, that was part of how the city, both, Raleigh and Cary, are going to pursue federal funding to construct the BRT service, and potentially some of the cost of constructing Western Boulevard itself. So that is, those were public processes, and that vote did take place at a public meeting. So that's kind of, I think, is the answer to that question.
I'll add just one thing to that on the topic of voting. There is a phase of this, the corridor study for Western BRT is the adoption of that study plan. Does have a public hearing on April 5th at 7 p.m. So the city council is looking at the adoption of the Western corridor study soon.
Steve Garganis has a question. He's also had his hand up and he's been patiently waiting. So
Yes, thank you, Steve.
Yeah, if we can answer this question and then probably answer any other questions Steve has. So this question is, when will this appear at PC, and when will Western BRT be operational?
So we expect the Planning Commission to take this request up in April. At their committee of the whole meeting, at least right now, it looks like that it will be scheduled for their April committee of the whole meeting.
And then the BRT being operational, I think the target for Western is 2026 to be taking passengers, and I think for Southern 2027.
Steve, did you have any other questions you want to ask while we're?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'm a land planner and represent the property owners of the Plaza West Shopping Center. And I work at Womble Bond Dickinson, which is a law firm downtown. I'm not an attorney, I'm a planner. And our client is concerned that, at least for the area that's west of, say, the old Kmart shopping center, that it feels premature, that it's not ripe yet. We certainly understand the need to link the BRT and land use. But here, if this rezoning moves forward, it will not allow an option for redevelopment at TOD standards, but pretty much mandate it. And here we're looking at probably the earliest 2026, and possibly beyond that, for Western BRT to be operational. And the rezoning thus just feels a bit premature. I think, and would like to have a conversation with staff about this, that there are potential unintended consequences of laying this on top of an existing property, and constraints that I would just like to hear staff comments on, what the options are. The density that we see now is really inside Method Road. We haven't seen hardly any density on, and of course, a large part of the area is under NC State's domain, on Western Boulevard at all. Most of that has, of course, occurred on Hillsborough Street. There is the Mission Valley Shopping Center, the Food Line Shopping Center on Western, and then the Kmart, old Kmart Shopping Center, all of which are very large parcel or larger parcel properties where this may make a whole lot of sense. And It probably does in the context of BRT, but to put this on top of properties by mandate as opposed to option and opt-in versus opt-out, for example, especially outside of or just slightly outside the belt line, really feels to be putting the cart before the horse. And where you have existing developments such as the shopping center, there could be requirements that would really limit investment in the shopping center at the present time. It may not be, from a business perspective, financially realistic to make some of the investments that would be required now, even though shopping centers really require that type of investment on an ongoing basis to remain desirable places for tenants. And so of course, we're still learning a lot about this. We're talking about it this evening and then tomorrow perhaps. But the market demand for Western doesn't appear to be there. There have not been, to my knowledge, a whole lot of rezoning requests to ask for anywhere near the type of density that's being required under this TOD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Steve, I mean, we're happy to have more conversation with you and your client about the Plaza West Shopping Center. Just in response to the question of whether first of all, the TOD does have a minimum height of 2 stories and does prohibit certain uses. I think those are the primary things that are presenting an obstacle for your client's situation. But in response to the question of whether there's demand, I do want to point to recent development activity on Chapel Hill Road, which, while not being Western Boulevard, I believe is similarly situated in terms of its location between downtown Raleigh and downtown Cary. And there has been significant activity in the area along Corporate Center Drive, along Nowell Road for multifamily housing with height of 5 stories, 4 stories. And we have a zoning case in right now with a request for 7 stories between Nowell Road and Corporate Center Drive. Additionally, we've also had preliminary meetings with the owner of an office development on Chapel Hill Road, who is looking to develop infill development within their parking lot to provide complementary uses to their office development. So I think those are strong signals that there is interest in taller and mixed-use development. And the TOD only requires 2 stories. That's the minimum. So it's not saying you have to build 5 or 7. Now, once you get to 2, it's more likely that you're going to want to go to 4 or 5 because it probably makes more economic sense if you're going to redevelop a site or do infill development to have additional stories. But I just want to add that in for context, that information. If you'd like to set up a meeting with staff, we can certainly do that.
Yep, good points. Both. Again, we're concerned about potential consequences where you have existing development, but there are other folks that probably want to talk and ask questions, and so I would like to circle back with you and others when you get a chance. Thank you, John.
There was a question. It's my understanding that the areas included in the TOD are part of a preliminary selection of properties by planning. Is this the case? And as the BRT design continues, will there continue to be properties added to the TOD after? It says text change. I assume he means rezoning goes into effect. Yeah, so like I was saying earlier,
there is very likely to be basically this whole process repeated in 2 to 3 years after there is a more detailed corridor planning study. For now, we, like Hannah said, there is the Western Boulevard corridor plan that's going to City Council on April 5th. That was kind of a preliminary, more transportation focused corridor plan that was really to kind of establish the street and bicycle pattern that would support BRT. But there was always an understanding that it would be, as the engineering work of the bus rapid transit route moved to more detail over the next few years, that there would also be an accompanying more detailed corridor plan that would get into more specifics about land use and things like that. So yeah, that basically this is the motivation here, and I think this also speaks to Steve's question, is that the city council became aware that there is development occurring on Western Boulevard, and particularly the area basically from 440 over to Powell Drive and to Jones Franklin. That was, for in a lot of cases, new single family neighborhoods. So the area, you know, just west of Blue Ridge Road has had a lot of new single family development. And I think the city council was wary that if that pattern continued, it would be detrimental to the effectiveness of the bus rapid transit service. And so there is a desire to basically ensure that if that pattern of redevelopment continues, that it is going to be housing types that are not $400,000 to $500,000 single family houses, but which are potentially, you know, small apartment buildings, townhouses, things that may be more affordable to folks who are not quite that level of income. And so that's what the TOD is to do. And then at the same time, to encourage a mixing of those uses with the complementary commercial uses, the employment, the services, the things that those folks are going to want to visit on their way to and from work, or go to, that, you know, is also a workplace. So that, you know, so yeah, there was a little bit of expediency desired with this first pass, and then there's going to be a more detailed planning process.
There were a couple of comments. I think Joe Joyner has his hand up. He had mentioned that the TOD supersedes the conservation overlay, I assume neighborhood conservation overlay. I just wanted to confirm if that's true or not.
That's correct.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Am I allowed to speak right now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Just first, I want to say I'm excited to participate in the civic process. This is my first meeting to attend. So thank you for allowing my input to be heard. I am here today as a resident in the Glosson Estates neighborhood that is off of Chapel Hill Road. It does not connect to Western Boulevard. And the Transit Overlay District has 3 properties within Glosson Estates are currently touched by the overlay district. And the future land use map for the city of Raleigh calls Glosson Estates a, what do they call it? Something along the lines of a office residential mixed use for further, for future land use development, and says that this category is applied primarily to frontage lots along major streets where low density residential uses are no longer appropriate. So I was just wondering about this particular neighborhood, why Glosson Estates is not deemed appropriate for the area. And second, I would like to say that the inclusion of the 3 parcels within Glosson Estates, I'm still wondering if you used just the parameters you've already mentioned and sort of ran things through a search and IMAPs, and it's like, hey, you know, if a property is a 1/4 acre or larger and is within 1/4 of a mile of the proposed district, we will include these properties. And if that's where we are at the stage in the process, or if we are further along where the planning department has more carefully reviewed the, you've gone through the first pass, included the buffer, got your properties, but then, by eye and hand, looking at the map, have reviewed it to see which properties are included. Because, for me, it's important to know where we are in that process to know how concerned I should be about the transit overlay district being applied to just a couple parcels in a closed neighborhood that would inherently change the character of the neighborhood should it go through, and then also, I guess I'm just wondering how planned it is that Gloucester Estates is part of it being included in the transit overlay district, on only a small part of it, but even if a small part of it is included, it would have significant effect on the entire neighborhood. And it feels a little bit like we, residents of Gloucester Estates, are being told we are no longer appropriate for the area, and we are being pushed out to make room for the office and commercial residential mixed use. And so we don't even have access to Western Boulevard, and walkability and rapid transit are great, but we don't have parks. We're one of the only neighborhoods in the area with trees, and their transit overlay district pretty much wiped out the tree conservation area provisions, largely so. And so there's a lot of concern from myself and many residents in the neighborhood about the intention of the city of Raleigh to develop a parcel in our neighborhood and then annex us and essentially force us out. Or am I jumping the gun and feeling that way, and we are still just kind of not at the fine-tooth comb step of the process?
Okay, so I'm going to walk through those points step by step. So how did we choose the properties to include in the overlay district? And so it was basically what you described, essentially an algorithm. Basically, we set a set of criteria, and then we said which properties meet those criteria. And so the 3 properties that you've noted are included because they are either in an area that is designated on the future land use map to be mixed use in the future, or if they are residentially zoned, they are larger than 1 acre. Those are, I think, the most likely criteria that captured those 3 lots. And so one thing I want to point out is that on 2 sides, Gloucester Estates is bordered by multifamily development. So I think there is probably some question as to what the existing character of that area is.
Well, both of those sides are one property which doglegs around the back of the neighborhood, and there's not a direct connection from Gloucester Estates to that neighborhood. So I would argue that it's hard for me to see that, that development affected the character of the neighborhood. Of course, when you dogleg in a couple of giant apartment buildings into a tight spot, and the result of which is a degradation in the water quality for everyone in the entire neighborhood who is on well. But to suggest that, that one neighborhood, we would say that neighborhood being shoehorned in there is actually what is out of character for the neighborhood, as that there is more single family residential housing on the other sides, as well as a rural farm. So it seems more so like the character is, it's right there in a document that is, adopted into policy for the city of Raleigh, that the area is no longer appropriate, and that this is an effort to force the
I'd like to continue my answer, please.
All right, thank you. You're right.
So at some point, your neighborhood will connect with the new alignment of Western Boulevard, and those 3 properties will all be about 1/3 of a mile away from Western Boulevard, and so we'll be within a reasonable pedestrian walking distance. Now, there are some gaps in the street network.
I thought the threshold for a reasonable walking distance was 1/4 of a mile. I thought that's what you stated earlier.
Between 1/4 and 1/2 a mile is what I stated earlier.
Okay, I misheard you. I thought you said 1/4.
Then the other thing is 2 of those properties are less than 2 acres. And so even without the transit overlay district, would not be subject to tree conservation requirements. And so, I think the thought process is, as is demonstrated by the large apartment development that has recently been constructed adjacent to your neighborhood, there is demand for additional housing of a type that is a wider variety of housing than what is currently represented in some of that area. And we expect that demand to continue. And so again, one of the goals of this is to allow for those additional housing types. Now, I want to be extremely clear that no one wants to force you to leave your home. And the city is effectively, for the most part, legally unable to force you to annex your property unless you wish to annex your property to the city. So, and I think one thing that's important to recognize in the properties that you've pointed out is your house one of these properties? I mean, are you the owner of one of those properties?
No, sir.
Right, and so your property is not included in the transit overlay district. So, beyond the fact that the city does not force anyone to develop any property anytime. Development of private property is the purview of the private property owner. And so, beyond that, your property is not included in the overlay district. So you're not even subject to the nonconformity issues that potentially other property owners would be
Right, but if the
subject to.
property across the street, the one directly across the street from me is included in the district, and the development over the years has continually degraded the water table in the area, and we are on county water. We are not part of the city. So if a development goes in the middle of the neighborhood, that it conforms to the transit overlay district, that completely transforms the entire neighborhood due to the location of it in the central area of the neighborhood. And then I'm wondering, are we going to, is the city going to annex the whole area? Is the city so the city's not going to annex, it's just going to force a type of development that is going to further degrade the water table, right? Without doing anything to rectify the situation.
Sir, I'm going to respond to those 2 points, and then I do need for us to move on. Number one, again, the city is not going to force anyone to develop anything. Private property owners choose to develop their property and choose whether or not they want to annex into the city. The other thing is, if someone builds multifamily housing, or really anything beyond a single family house, so duplex and up, they are going to be required by the city to connect to city utilities. So I'm not exactly sure I understand what you mean when you refer to the water table, but multifamily development would basically be prohibited from using well water. It would have to use the Raleigh Public Utilities water supply. So in terms of reducing the water table, I don't know of the mechanism of how that would occur through multifamily development.
Well, that happens through displacing stormwater runoff. And when you're talking about the type of development that uses as much impervious surface as multifamily residential housing, and then you're waiving the tree conservation areas, you are left with large amounts of impervious surface. So stormwater that previously went in one direction or was absorbed here, there, the other, is now being funneled in different directions. And so when we're talking about this 4.5 acre property in the middle of a single family residential neighborhood that all has half-acre properties, and you're talking about a property that has significant importance in terms of the environmental services, the ecosystem services it provides to the entire neighborhood. So if that property is developed in the way that conforms to the TOD, you're going to start seeing all sorts of adverse impacts, just like we saw after the development of that apartment complex that doglegged in there. Water quality has declined, and that is not subjective, that is objective. And I'm aware of what happens when a property is annexed and connecting city services. My question was, if that property in the middle gets developed, that 4.5 acre property gets developed and it's subject to the TOD and they have to connect city water there, I am still in the county outside, I still am on that well water. Correct? So my water, it continues to degrade, as well as the character of the neighborhood. So it is I'm just, struggling with that impact. So yes, one of my property is not one of the 3 specifically touched by the overlay district, but in a way it feels a little bit like redlining in that you make a little change to this one parcel in the area, it is going to force a sea change to the entire neighborhood. And I guess that is to be expected when the entire neighborhood has been deemed no longer appropriate.
All I'm going to say before we move on is if you do have any kind of analysis to demonstrate issues with your water quality, I'd be happy to take a look at those and share those with the city stormwater and public utility staff. But let's move to the next question.
Wanda Gilbert Coker asked, how does the BRT offer protections to the community?
I'm sorry, can you say the question one more time?
How does the BRT offer protections to the community?
Protections to the community. I guess I'm not exactly sure what is meant by the question. Is it possible to get some elaboration on the question?
Wanda, are you available to come to the mic and just give us some clarification?
Yeah, I have some background noise. My point was, I heard early in the call that there would be some protections allowed with the TOD, BRT. And so I'm wondering exactly what are those protections? Or did I mishear that?
Protections. That might be in reference to the nonconformities that might be created when this is applied to single family properties. And so what that meant is if you have a single family house and the TOD is applied to your property, your single family house becomes non-conforming as a use. So there's a use called single unit living, which means a house where there's only a single family or a single household living in that house. That use becomes non-conforming. Another potential nonconformity for many of the single family houses, not many, but some of the single family houses that the TOD could be applied to is if they are 1 story. The minimum height in the TOD is 2 stories. And so what those protections mean is, like I described earlier in the meeting, is basically you can continue to occupy the house as a single family house, as a single household, for as long as you wish. You are legally entitled to do that. And that's what's called a legal nonconformity. It means the use or the structure was legal when it was built, and then it became against the zoning. And so as long as it is maintained and occupied, it can remain the way it is. Where that can become an issue is if you either vacate the property for a certain period of time and then try to come back, then the city can say, well, now that you're coming back, you need to be conforming. You need to reestablish a use that is conforming. So you need to have a duplex here. I think that for a single family, the other issue about the height is if you want to have an addition on a single family house. And that can be an issue for both the use and the structure being non-conforming if it's a single story. And so if you wanted to do an addition, then you may need to go to the Board of Adjustment and get a special use permit. And basically what that is doing is saying the goal of this district is to encourage people to transition their property from single family to different types of housing. And so again, like I said before in the meeting, if you just want to make a single family house bigger and bigger and bigger, or tear it down and make a larger house, we don't think that is supportive of successful bus rapid transit. And it's not supportive of affordability either. And so if you are going to be doing new development or expansions, the outcome of that should be additional housing units. So that's what it's meant by protections. Basically, you can keep your house as is. You are protected if you just stay the way you are. It's when you try to change things that you might run into issues.
Okay, I heard you make the comment, like you said, if you want to leave and come back. When you say leave, meaning like if you want to rent it and move to wherever for whatever reason, and then come back.
Now you could rent it. You could rent your house. It's if the house is vacant. Basically, if the house is vacant for 2 years, and then you tried to come back, that's when the city would say, well, you had single family, but then it was empty for 2 years. When you come back, how are you going to come back with a use that's conforming?
Okay, so who's going around checking to see if my house is vacant as long as I'm paying taxes? Is that code enforcement or who?
So that type of violation would be, the city is not going to go around looking to see whether you're living in your house. Now, the way that it's enforced is if your neighbor called the city and said, the house next to me, like if it was vacant and it wasn't boarded up and there was like people going in there or something, or it was becoming an eyesore for the neighborhood, somebody might call the city and say, I don't like that there's this vacant house next to me. And then we would have documentation, right? At the point that that person calls the city and says, there's nobody there, and they send out a zoning enforcement person, they check and they say, oh yeah, there's nobody here. Then that would be the documentation where 2 years after that contact, you could prove, you could say, well, here's some bills. I have an electric bill or a water bill in the intervening time that proves I did come back before the deadline. Then yeah, you could do that. You could prove you were there. But yeah, it's based on reports of other people. We don't have enforcement going out proactively to try to find those violations. It's just we don't have enough staff to do that.
Okay, thank you for the warning. I got to let the community know.
Okay.
Joe Hartman asked, will the TOD standards require sidewalk infill retroactively? And if not, how will people walk to BRT safely?
Mm-hmm. It would not require retroactive sidewalk construction by private property owners. There's just really no legal mechanism to do that. So the way that would occur is through the corridor planning processes, like I mentioned before. So for example, like I said, New Bern Avenue has a station area planning process that's going on right now. And part of the recommendations for that is going to be where we need to fill in sidewalk gaps. And so we're going to have a list of projects that are going to be included in that station area planning report that comes out, and that'll go to the city council. And if city council approves that, then those projects go to the city's transportation department to put into their budgets and to fund and then to build those projects. And so, like I said, we'll be doing similar corridor planning for the western and southern corridors, and they will produce similar recommendations to fill in sidewalk gaps. And then the other thing is the city has our capital improvement program. We have transportation bonds about every 3 years or so. And then the transportation department does have some amount of operating funds, your annual funding. So those are all funding mechanisms that, even outside of a corridor planning process, the transportation department is every year just picking out sidewalk projects to fund with those monies. And so, obviously they're never completing the entire citywide sidewalk network, but each year they're adding a little bit more in addition to anything special from a corridor plan.
And I think Lindsay asked a related question. I think you answered it with your answer there. So Lindsay, if that didn't answer your question, feel free to add another question to the chat. Jeff Denny asked if you could explain the loss or minimization of transition yards. He's an R10 right behind NX.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what that says is in the way neighborhood transition works currently is when there is a mixed use district, which is basically the districts in Raleigh that allow mixed use development, commercial development, and higher density multifamily development. When there's one of those districts next to a residential district, the mixed use district is required to provide a setback of the buildings from the property boundary with the residential district. And there's 3 zones. The first zone is you have to have a landscape area that can either be 10 feet wide with a masonry wall, 20 feet wide with a wood fence or other material fence, or 50 feet wide with just the landscaping planting. And then outside of that landscaping area, this is under the typical rules. There is a 50-foot building setback, and then at the point of the 50-foot building setback, there is a maximum building height of 40 feet, and then the building is allowed to increase by 1 foot for every foot that it moves into the property. What the TOD says is that minimum 50-foot building setback and the height transition are no longer required. So it's just the landscaping yard and the fence or the wall. So yes, that is less of a transition when, excuse me, the TOD is adjacent to a residential district. That's correct. It is not as much of a transition as would typically be required.
Natasha Gaynor, I actually apologize. I missed one of her questions above, so I'll go to that one and then we can go to her second question. So Natasha asked, what non-voluntary affordable housing development is planned? I noticed it's required for a height bonus.
Well, I think the question says what non-voluntary affordable housing is required. And so just to make it very clear, in the state of North Carolina, the state law says that local governments are forbidden from making zoning rules that require affordable units in private development. If the city passes a zoning law that says when you build a development of a certain size, you must include affordable units, the state is going to tell us, well, what'll happen is the property owner would probably sue, and then it would be upheld in court, or the state could potentially, send us a cease order or something like that. I don't know. It's not legal. And so that's why we have to use the density bonus, the height bonus, because the height bonus is optional. It's basically saying if the developer wants the extra height, in return for getting the extra height, they must provide a public benefit in the form of affordable housing. But we cannot say you're allowed to build 5 stories, but and you can't say you always have to have affordable units. You can say if this, then that. You cannot say you always have to have affordable units. And I went through, at the beginning of the meeting, a lot of the programs that the city has for affordable housing production, and those are not through zoning. That's not a zoning requirement. It is expenditures. The city spends money to either produce our own projects, or what is much more likely, to provide additional financing for private and nonprofit projects that are producing affordable housing. And then the city can also help to acquire land or sell city land at a low cost, or allow affordable housing to be built on city land to assist with the cost of those developments. So, those are the mechanisms that the city has to encourage and to provide affordable units. We do not have a mechanism to absolutely require them.
And her second question was, what is the core transit area? What regulations, mapping, zoning are set, and where can she view the mapped core transit area?
Core transit area is something that's on the city's urban form map. So the urban form map is basically it's policy. So it's not a law. It doesn't have legally binding effect in terms of what you can or cannot do to your property. It is basically saying if someone wishes to rezone their property, the urban form map helps the city council and the planning commission to decide whether different types of zoning are appropriate. And so the core transit areas are the areas around the bus rapid transit station areas. to the best extent that they were known at the time that that was adopted, and they may be adjusted over time. But you can find those. The best way to look at those is to go into a mapping platform that's called iMaps. And I think we can put a link to that in the chat. But iMaps is the Wake County tax map. Essentially, it's all the parcels in Wake County, and it allows you to look up by address or property ID. You can look up who the owner is, when it was last bought or sold, last purchased, what the tax appraised value is, all those things. And then in addition, it has all of Raleigh's zoning map and all of Raleigh's policy maps. So like the urban form map and the future land use map that Mr. Joyner was referring to earlier. And so if you go to the link on iMaps, there is a button on the right side that's called layers. And so if you click on that, you'll see a set of layers. And one of those layers is called planning and development. And then within planning and development, there's another one called Raleigh planning and development. And so you'll need to turn on and expand both of those. And then within the Raleigh planning and development set of layers, there is one called urban form. So you can turn that on, and that will show you where those core transit areas are. And so the impact of that is if the core transit area is applied over a piece of property, then it basically says that area is more suitable to additional density, mixed use development, should have those urban frontages that I described at the beginning of the meeting that require the buildings to be closer to the street, that require those higher quality sidewalks. So it's really basically saying these are the areas where we'd like to see the denser mixed use development that is supportive of walking and transit and having integrated land uses where you don't have to drive a car as much.
Joshua Bradley asked, what guarantees can the city give to prevent gentrification along the route? Are there going to be tax waivers and reserved areas for low-cost housing, in parentheses, affordable by low-wage workers?
Let's see. So I'm going to just read that comment. I think I can find it. I wanted to see those last three options. Can you just read the last part about
Yeah, are there going to be tax waivers and reserved areas for low-cost housing? In parentheses, affordable by low-wage workers.
Mm-hmm. So it is very difficult for the city to guarantee that existing, and this is where we have to differentiate between subsidized affordable housing and market rate affordable housing, or what is sometimes also known as naturally occurring affordable housing. So, when I say the city is going to support the production of new affordable housing units, that means housing units where the price of rent is lower than the actual cost of building and maintaining the building, because a nonprofit or the federal government or the city or someone is offsetting the cost of constructing and maintaining that building in order to allow the rent to be lower than economically it ought to be to pay those costs. That's subsidized affordable housing. There is other, and that's what people typically mean when they say affordable. I mean, that's kind of, or they say big A affordable housing. But market rate affordable housing or naturally occurring affordable housing is that, in a lot of cases, when housing just gets a little bit older, then the price that you can get for rent just goes down. People will pay more rent for a newer house than an older house, or a newer apartment than an older apartment. Also, sometimes apartments are just smaller, and so may be more affordable. And so those things are naturally occurring affordable housing. They just are affordable because they're in a particular state of condition where they could be offered at a lower rent that's affordable for more households. It is very difficult for the city to prevent private property owners from redeveloping naturally occurring affordable housing into new housing. There's just not many legal means that we have to tell someone you can't tear down a building on your property. And so that's why the main mechanism we have is to encourage the construction of new subsidized affordable housing and new market rate affordable housing that is more likely to be a market rate affordable for a wider range of income levels. So typically apartments, especially like 3-story garden apartments, like the type you see along Buck Jones Road, that style of construction, garden apartments with densities of about 15, 20, 25 units per acre, 3 stories tall, surface parking, those styles of apartments are the cheapest to build. And so even if you build new apartments in that style, they still can rent for fairly reasonable rates that are affordable to, it's not gonna be affordable to 30% area median income. They'll be affordable to more households than, a downtown condo in an elevator building. There are lower costs. So those are the two mechanisms we have. We can try to encourage subsidized affordable housing to be developed by helping with the financing, and we can allow private developers to build more multifamily housing that is just by nature of the way it's constructed, likely to be lower cost than a single family house on its own lot. That's pretty much the most expensive kind of housing that there is, a single family house on its own lot. So I will say in terms of tax relief, Wake County does have a program that allows, there are 2 categories of people who could seek relief from property taxes from Wake County. If you are an elder, and if you are a military veteran, I think it's elders, veterans, and disabled people, I think but it's a narrow set of categories where you can get tax relief. And that information is available on the Wake County Revenue Department webpage. So those programs are available. People can make use of those. There has been some conversation at the city of, could the city have tax relief programs for existing homeowners? Those things there are state laws that make those difficult. The state has limited the ability to do that, but the way that would probably function is more likely to be that it wouldn't be tied to, it wouldn't be a property tax reduction. It would be more like a grant for existing homeowners. So we don't have anything like that existing, but I have heard people talk about that. So if that's something you'd like to advocate, I would encourage you to reach out to your council member and say that you're interested in that idea. But we don't have anything in development for that right now.
Shelby put in the chat that the TOD map is misleading, as lots not in purple appear to be clear of zoning changes, but the core transit area will impact those areas. So this entire process seems to be intentionally lacking in transparency.
Well, the information we're trying to convey with this process is that the city has initiated a rezoning case that will change the zoning for particular property. And so those are the properties you see in the purple in the TOD mapping viewer. Properties that are not shown in purple are not subject to their zoning being changed by this city initiated rezoning. Any property owner, any private property owner anywhere in the city may request that their property be rezoned. And there are many, many locations throughout the city where the type of zoning that would be supported by the city's policy maps, the future land use map and the urban form map, there are many, many places where the existing zoning is not to the full density or range of uses that is supported by those policy maps. So I think part of that statement is accurate. There are places that could request to rezone if a private property owner wished, and the city's policy maps would support greater density or a wider range of commercial uses. Part of that statement I would disagree with. I believe we are being transparent in saying whose property is subject to a city initiated rezoning right now. And that is what we were showing.
There was a question about whether the comments and questions here will be shared with the Planning Commission.
Yeah, I think what we've been doing is we can save the chat from these meetings. I think we had said we want to make the chat available.
So we are recording this meeting. The video will be available on the project page as soon as we can get the video uploaded. And I do think we also get the chat. Formally, we're required to record all the topics discussed tonight. So Planning Commission will get a summary of that. And then they will also get all of the comments put into the rezoning engagement portal as well.
It looks like Shelby maybe is looking for some more clarification on the impact of core transit area on adjacent parcels to TOD.
So yeah, I feel like I did respond that the core transit area gives policy guidance as to what type of zoning would be appropriate in the future. It says that more dense residential development and mixed use development would be appropriate. That describes the parcels along the BRT routes that have the core transit area. If those property owners wish to petition the city council for rezoning, those policies would support additional residential density or mixed use development in those locations in many instances. Now, some of those locations are already zoned for the type of development that is recommended by the core station area. But I believe I was pretty clear that yes, it does say that if those private property owners want to rezone, the city policy would support some additional density and mixed use development. I don't feel like that's misleading at all. I think that's about as transparent as we can be.
I know that there's been a couple of people with their hands up, so I want to ask Hunter Strickland to unmute if he had a question.
Hey, no, I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to say I'm born in Raleigh. I've lived here my whole life, and it makes me really happy to see Raleigh taking steps to try and like become more walkable and like a more dense place to live. I'm here because I lived and now rent out property that's in the Driftwood Manor HOA at 1010 Sandlin. So I guess we're already part of the whole TOD thing and kind of fitting into that use case. But yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for hosting this meeting and like, you know, good stuff.
Thank you.
And then there's a user with initials HK also with their hand up.
Yes, I wanted to ask, and I apologize if you covered this before, but it's my understanding that the areas that are currently included in the TOD are part of a preliminary selection of properties by planning. So is this the case? And if so, as the BRT design continues, is there going to continue to be properties added to the TOD after the text change goes into effect?
Yeah, so let me start from the end of the question and I'll work backwards. So you said text change. So what we are talking about is not a text change. We are talking about a rezoning. So rezoning means that the text of the transit overlay district already exists in the city's zoning code, which is called the Unified Development Ordinance. We are now saying where in the real world that text will apply. And that's the overlay district. So we're actually mapping it out on property in the real world is the purpose of this process. And so I just want to be very clear that, yes, as I stated before, there is likely to be a subsequent process that will be called a corridor plan or a station area planning process for Western Boulevard that will come up with more rezoning recommendations for this area. But the result of this process is that properties will be rezoned. That's what this proposal is. If it's approved by the city council, it means that the zoning map will change for properties when the city council makes that decision. So in the next 3 to 4 months. So okay. I don't want it to be misleading that this is that we're going to show this map and then we're going to wait for a couple of years and then the rezoning's going to go through. There's going to be 2 rezonings, one now and another one. And so the one there, the one later could add more parcels, and it also could change the underlying zoning, so the base district. So right, so the TOD is an overlay district that can go on top of residential districts and mixed use districts. That later process could add more TOD. It could also say the base district should also change.
So this is not referring to TC 17A20.
So that was the text change that created the overlay district. So that basically established what does the overlay do if it applies to your property? How does it change how you can develop your property? Because that's the first thing you have to do. You have to say, what is the district and what does it do? So that was what the text change was. It was putting that into the zoning code. And then now that we have that in the zoning code and we have established what it does, now we have to put it onto properties in the real world. You have to put it on the map so that we know whose property is actually affected by it, whose property is now going to be able to be developed in different ways because of that overlay. You have to say where it goes. And that's what this is.
Okay, so the list of properties that has been mailed out to everybody, that's going to be part of the initial rezoning process, and there could potentially be another process in which people want to be added to the transit overlay district later on.
Yeah, and really, it's going to sound bad for me to say this. I mean, we hope they want to be added, but the way that the station area planning process works is it's more that we're trying to think of which properties make sense to be able to have these additional development options. And as you can see by this meeting, some people don't agree with that evaluation. Some people don't want it to be added. So I can't guarantee that the basis of this rezoning and future rezoning is not someone saying, I would like to be rezoned. I mean, it is city initiated, so it's coming from the city. Again, we hope you understand why this is beneficial both for property owners and the general public interest.
I understand why it's beneficial for property owners. This will not benefit me. This will make it very difficult for me to continue to live in the place that I currently live.
I'm assuming that you are renting, that you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
So,
a lot of the people that are going to be pushed out of this area.
Well, I think the way that I would encourage you to think about this, and I know that this is not satisfying for many people, but this is the reality of the situation, and this is how we as planners have to think about it, because we are charged with evaluating both very local, very personal impacts along with larger, longer term impacts, is that Raleigh is growing. There is huge demand for housing in Raleigh. And that demand is not going to disappear if we pretend like it's not there. And so there are a few different ways that demand can be expressed. One way is that existing houses and existing multifamily housing are torn down and replaced with exactly the same number of housing units. They are just more expensive. Another way that demand can be served or expressed is that existing buildings are torn down and that there are more housing units built in their place, and potentially smaller and more affordable housing units built in their place. And I want to point to an example on Western Boulevard, immediately west of Blue Ridge Road, between Blue Ridge Road and Powell Drive. There are entire subdivisions being built right now, completely composed of single family houses. And those single family houses, I have to assume, are going for upwards of $400,000. So the question that we have to ask as planners is, if we know there's going to be development, because we cannot prevent private property owners from developing their property, do we want to say the only thing you can develop is single family houses? Or do we want to say to them, you could also build townhouses and apartments. And our hope is that if they choose townhouses and apartments, those rents will be more affordable than them replacing a small single family house with a much larger single family house.
The townhomes that were just built near me on Lexington Drive were listed for $3,700 a month. I currently am trying to pay $800 a month, and that's across the street from me. That
Right.
happened
So-
within the last couple of years, which means that that rezoning went through at the same time that the BRT planning was already happening.
Yeah, and so I think there's a matter of timing. And so again, from a big picture perspective, just in a basic sense, the way that we approach this is that housing is subject to the principle of supply and demand. If there is enough supply to exhaust the demand, the prices come down. And so what you're seeing is, yes, builders are building houses and townhouses for the highest income brackets now because they have not yet exhausted that demand. There are still so many people who are in those higher income levels trying to move to Raleigh that as long as the development pattern remains low density, it will be difficult to basically to saturate the market for that higher end of the housing market. And so until you can do that, builders are not likely to build lower cost housing because the higher cost housing has higher margins. So it really comes down to, yes, there's going to be a lag where until we can exhaust that, the prices probably aren't going to come down right away because the demand is just so huge. I mean, it's difficult to express the amount of demand of people coming to Raleigh right now. And so the supply side is the way that we can affect that, but it can take a while. And I know that's just, it's not satisfying. I recognize that. It's very difficult to find an affordable place to live in Raleigh right now. But we're not going to fix it by building more bigger single family houses.
I hear you. I'm going to end on this note. I understand very well how supply and demand works in this area. It's the third fastest growing city in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that gentrifying and displacing low income people and expecting them to roll over and be okay with that and expecting to have those people fill positions and be laborers in the city of Raleigh doesn't make sense to me. So that's what I got to say to that.
We have one more person with the hand up, Joshua Bradley.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Is the city considered something like a property tax that is progressive to where more expensive housing is taxed at a higher rate than lower cost housing? Anything to disincentivize building of luxury and market rate homes, especially now, because it is going to come a day where who's going to do the work when no one that has a frontline job can afford to live in the city.
So, I mean, I'll focus on the term you use, progressive, because the property tax value, the amount of property tax that someone pays is linear. That the more your property is worth, the more tax you pay. So that the larger and more expensive your house is, the more property tax you pay on the structure. And so by progressive, so by progressive, you mean that not only would it be based on the valuation, but the actual rate would increase depending on how high the value is. And my understanding is that that is not legal under state law, but I don't know that for certain.
I'm pretty sure it is legal. I've done some research into it. I mean, there's a maximum amount of tax that the city could charge, but we're not charging anywhere near that. But if you layered it, like every valuation over every $100,000 over, $250,000, you pay an extra percent or 0.1% up until the maximum allowed by law. And then if you could earmark that extra revenue to actually not sell city properties and actually, instead of selling them cheaply to developers to build market rate, quote, affordable housing for people that make $80,000 a year, what you could do is actually build housing, public housing with that money. And then that might alleviate some of the problem of the fact that everything that y'all were doing and the fact that we are the third fastest growing city in the country is going to do nothing but push people out that actually do the work in the city. That's all. Over.
Well, I think we're a little bit off topic from the TOD rezoning, and we are getting towards the end of our meeting time. So let's maybe take one or two more questions, and then we can bring the meeting to a close. Do we have any more questions?
I see Anne with her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I've been listening to everything this evening, and one thing that keeps coming back to me over and over is you talk about affordable housing and how the city doesn't feel that those of us who have larger lots are using our lots appropriately, or that we should be forced to put in more multifamily homes, or those that are struggling to pay our rent and our property taxes, which as they go up, I, as a disabled person, will be struggling. And who knows if I can keep the house that I have spent my whole life working for and paying for. What I can feel like is that the state, the city, the planners are saying, we know what's best for you. And it doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what you paid for. It doesn't matter where you moved. We know what's best. And guess what? We're going to kick you out by forcing you through these TODs and rezonings, et cetera, to bend to our will because we know better. What I do see also is that there is no encroachment in areas where people are not working class. You are not going to the upper areas of people who have higher incomes and forcing them on their 1 acre properties to build multifamily homes, or saying what you can and cannot build. You're not doing that. You're coming to areas like ours where we are working class, where we are struggling to pay our $800 a month. And you're taking it over because guess what? We don't matter as much, it seems. That's what it feels like as I've listened to you speak this evening. And I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll respond to a couple of those points. Number one, the location of these recommendations is based on the public investment in transit. And so, yeah, there are wealthy neighborhoods in Raleigh that don't have transit service running through them.
Let me stop you right there, because right now, when you guys are talking about rezoning Buck Jones Road, that property, and putting up 32 townhomes with a starting price of $625,000, which is over $2,000 more than any home in Roiling Acres. You're saying,
ma'am, that's a different zoning case. That's being brought by a private developer.
Goes to my point. It goes to my point where you're saying, you're basically saying you're going to take over the area, you're putting buses through areas that you have decided needs them. But on the flip side, when you're allowing these higher end price points to come in, what I hear in your argument is that people who have money aren't going to ride the bus. People who are working hard every day, oh, guess what? We're going to ride a bus because you don't think we deserve to drive our cars. But yet you're allowing or encouraging high price point building to happen. So guess what? Those people like me who might need to ride the bus, where am I going to go that bus is even nearby? That's what is coming across.
So I guess I would challenge you to think to yourself, if someone builds houses at 8 to 10 units per acre and they charge $600,000 for them. If they build a brand new house on a half an acre, how much do you think they're going to charge for that house? More than $600,000. So yeah, and also again, that's a private developer and outside of the TOD area. If they build single family houses and sell them for $600,000, well, they can't build single family houses in the TOD. So that already is that argument doesn't fit
Why
in the TOD.
putting through these types of developments, these type of bus riderships through other areas of the city of a higher dollar amount? Why are you doing it here?
So the bus rapid transit, well, I think that's an excellent question that gets to your very first point, that the city is trying to force things or that planners think they know better. This rezoning is part of a process that started over 6 years ago when Wake County adopted the Wake Transit Plan. And that had a significant amount of public outreach. It also is funded by a sales tax referendum that was approved by a majority of voters. And then that was followed up by another process called equitable development around transit, where again, a majority of people said they supported additional development along these transit routes that they had already expressed support for by the approval of the Wake Transit Plan and the approval of the sales tax to pay for it. And so these ideas are not a group of planners in an office making things up. They have come from public engagement, including direct ballot referendum, to say that this is how the future of Raleigh should take place. And so, and I also want to respond to the word force. I assume, I'm not sure what you mean by force. I guess you're saying if your taxes go up, that is forcing you to move, but no one is forcing you to sell your house or redevelop your property
You
in any
were
particular way.
that couple that was talking about their 1 acre. Oh yeah, we're going to put this through your shed or whatever. Or you can't build a larger home on your property that you own because we don't think you should. And let me say this, the only reason the planning department supports the rezoning of Buck Jones Road 517 is because of the pending TOD and core transit area. Otherwise, our NCOD would not even be an issue. And that is from the lawyer on the other side.
I guess it's difficult to respond to these arguments, ma'am, because you within the same train of thought, you have said the houses that are proposed across the street are too expensive. Also that you wish to construct a larger house.
No, that I didn't say I wish to construct it. I said the planning department told that couple earlier that on their 1 acre lot, where the gentleman said that you showed development through his shed, that if he wanted to increase the size of his home, he would not be allowed to because the city doesn't feel that that's an appropriate use for his property in the TOD transit zone. That's what you said, and that's what I am saying.
Well,
that's what you said.
It's not that you can't expand your home. You have to go to the Board of Adjustment and get a special use permit. So it's not.
That is not what you said earlier. You did not say that.
I have said that multiple times during this meeting.
I would say go back and listen because I've been listening, taking notes. That is what you said. And we'll just leave it at that.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we can bring the meeting to a close. Despite some friction, I appreciate all of you being here. And I think this is really important part of how the city makes these decisions together. And, you know, the next stages of this process are that this is going to go to the Planning Commission and the City Council. And so I can tell that there are strong feelings here. And I encourage you to participate in those stages of the process and express these exact concerns to those two bodies. I think that all of your concerns are relevant and valid and an important part of this process. And so again, thank you for being here. And just to give you a couple of next step, some information about the next steps in the process. This is slated to go to the Planning Commission on April the 21st. That is going to be a meeting called the Committee of the Whole. That is a special type of Planning Commission meeting where there is additional time for public comments, just like you've been sharing this evening. And you should receive a letter in the mail about that meeting in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks. So again, thank you for being here. If you do have follow-up questions, the email contact information for myself and Hannah are in the letter that you received. They're also available on the TOD mapping webpage. And so there, and also I do want to encourage you to, if you do want to submit any written comments, either put those into the engagement portal, which is linked from the TOD mapping webpage. And I will warn you that that portal will be closing in advance of the Planning Commission meeting because we do have to package up those comments to share them with the Planning Commission. So that will probably be closing around Friday, April the 8th. So if you have comments to put in the portal, that's an online survey. You can do it in the next 2 weeks. And then also you can send comments directly to the Planning Commission. Their email address is planning.commission@raleighnc.gov. So again, thank you so much for being here. And we do appreciate your enthusiasm. And so I hope everyone has a great evening.